In the glittering courts of medieval England, the promise of royal favour could vanish overnight, replaced by the cold steel of an executioner's blade. Under a monarchy built on fear and spectacle, treason was not just punished. It was staged as a public lesson in obedience. Those accused were stripped of their humanity, turned into symbols of betrayal, and paraded before the masses so that the king's power seemed unassailable. No myth, no legacy, no truth could stand against a ruler determined to erase it. Anne Boleyn was at first an enigma of fascination and desire, wielding her charm like a blade, more subtle than steel, reshaping the kingdom through whispered promises and calculated silences. Yet power in England was never more ephemeral than when it was held closest to the heart of a capricious king. The very allure that elevated Anne, the sharp wit, the sparkling eyes that mocked convention, the boldness of her intellectual curiosity would later damn her as surely as if she had confessed to treason in open court. Within mere weeks, the adored queen, who once entranced a nation, was reimagined as a dangerous seductress, a harbinger of chaos. The charges laid against her were a tapestry woven from shadowed whispers: adultery, incest, witchcraft, sins, perfectly calibrated to inflame moral outrage, forever tainting her name. As Anne's star dimmed, courtiers retreated to safer distances, their memories conveniently altered by royal decree, their loyalty redirected towards survival. Her laughter, once celebrated as musical, became remembered as sinister mockery. Her grace and elegance reinterpreted as calculated seduction. The courtier's eyes, once dazzled by her brilliance, now saw only threat, a sharp-edged reminder of the volatile proximity between glory and ruin. Anne, isolated in her apartments, watched helplessly as her truth unraveled, beneath the court's silent judgment, understanding bitterly that her fall had become necessary theatre to reinforce the king's unquestionable dominance. Yet her trial was only the beginning of a darker performance, staged meticulously to demonstrate Henry VIII's ruthless capability to rewrite history. Anne's very identity was systematically disassembled. Her portraits quietly vanished from castle halls, her personal letters and documents confiscated and destroyed, her name struck from the rolls of honour. She was turned from a person into an abstraction, an idea of betrayal carefully shaped by royal decree. Her voice, so powerful in life, was silenced, entirely reduced to ghostly echoes in corners of forgotten rooms. The careful erasure of Anne from history became a sinister testament to the king's absolute authority, a brutal reminder that memory itself could be wielded as a weapon against those who dared threaten the royal narrative. And yet, for all Henry's deliberate cruelty, Anne retained her humanity in quiet acts of defiance. In the Tower Room, where she spent her last nights, stripped of finery, servants noted a haunting dignity, an unexpected grace born from resignation to fate. Reports whispered about how she knelt in prayer, her face pale but composed, reciting psalms that echoed softly against the stone walls. Anne's whispered prayers lingered, defying the silence imposed by her captors, an unsettling reminder of a truth that the king could not fully control or erase. As her final dawn approached, Anna would become not merely a victim, but a symbol of all that could be stolen and rewritten by power. Her execution, designed as spectacle, would resonate far beyond the swift strike of the blade, seeping into the stones of Tower Green, staining the memory of all who watched and haunting generations yet unborn. Anne Boleyn's trial was a carefully staged production engineered to break a woman and solidify a king's supremacy. The lavish halls of Westminster, where once she had danced joyfully beneath glittering chandeliers, now became an amphitheatre of her undoing. Noblemen who once vied for her attention sat now in solemn judgment, their faces turned coldly impassive expressions, rehearsed in private chambers to display neither sympathy nor recognition. The accusations against Anne were presented not as mere crimes, but as moral perversions, so grotesque, so foreign, that their very mention seemed to poison the air. The Queen stood isolated, her slender figure draped in mourning black, a startling contrast against the vibrant colours of those assembled to witness her disgrace. Her voice, once capable of charming ambassadors and disarming rivals, was reduced to quiet defiance, firm yet brittle. Her words, though articulate and precise, were twisted into damning evidence of her supposed cunning. When Anne pleaded innocence, declaring her fidelity and loyalty to the king, the court met her words with silent hostility, their judgment preordained, unmoved by sincerity or logic. In those tense moments, Anne recognized the true horror of her predicament. Justice itself had become an illusion. Every testimony against her was a performance carefully coached and rehearsed, stripping her words of power and leaving her arguments meaningless. George Boleyn, her beloved brother, stood accused beside her, dragged down by the twisted narrative that cast familial affection as depravity. The siblings exchanged quiet, anguished glances, the bond between them reinterpreted by the court's insidious imagination as proof of unthinkable sin. Here was a medieval spectacle designed to shock, to horrify, to remind everyone present that innocence mattered little against the weight of royal accusation. Yet beneath the courtroom's calculated veneer of justice, a quiet irony lingered. Many who condemned Anne knew her innocence, their consciences buried beneath political expediency and fear of royal wrath. Some privately felt the icy touch of guilt, sensing that their complicity in this theatre of cruelty had forever tainted their souls. But in the world of Henry VIII, survival demanded silence, loyalty required complicity, and moral hesitation was swiftly punished. Anne herself, once the central figure of a glittering court, now existed solely as the villain of a carefully constructed morality tale. She felt the crushing weight of isolation, each betrayal carving deeper wounds into her spirit than even the sharpest blade could inflict. Yet in her quiet dignity, she unwittingly became a mirror to those around her, a reflection of their own compromised humanity, their willingness to sacrifice truth upon the altar of self-preservation. Though the verdict was inevitable, the emotional undercurrents that rippled silently through the courtroom exposed the fragility and hollowness of power built upon fear. The final pronouncement, death by beheading, was delivered with solemn detachment, as though merely announcing a trivial detail rather than extinguishing a life. Anne's carefully composed expression faltered momentarily, a brief flicker of despair shadowing her dark eyes. Yet she quickly regained herself, understanding that even now, especially now, her every gesture would be scrutinized for weakness or guilt. She straightened her shoulders, meeting the eyes of her judges one last time, silently challenging their moral cowardice with an unwavering gaze. As she was escorted away, the court erupted into hushed murmurs, whispers filled with discomfort, and perhaps hidden shame. Anne's fate was sealed, yet the true judgment cast that day was upon the hearts and minds of those who had willingly abandoned justice. The theatre of accusation had done its work not merely by sentencing a queen to death, but by revealing the ease with which integrity itself could be sacrificed upon the throne's demand. In the days following her condemnation, Anne Boleyn experienced an isolation so profound that it felt like a slow erasure of the self. She was moved quietly to her chambers in the tower, where shadows gathered thickly in corners once illuminated by laughter and joy. The air itself seemed colder, tinged with a melancholy that clung to stone walls. There, confined within these familiar yet foreign quarters, Anne confronted the gradual dissolution of her own identity, a loss orchestrated meticulously by the hand of royal decree. Every symbol of Anne's former life was systematically stripped away, luxurious gowns replaced by simple, coarse garments, rich furnishings removed to leave bare, austere rooms. Even the delicate embroidery that adorned her personal linens was methodically ripped apart, threads loosened and unravelling in a cruel parallel to her own life's unravelling. Paintings bearing her likeness were quietly removed from palace walls, faces smudged and obscured, erased as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all. Yet perhaps the greatest cruelty lay not in this deliberate material erasure, but in the psychological dismantling of Anne herself. The woman who had once captivated a kingdom now felt increasingly ephemeral, her very sense of reality dissolving like mist beneath the ruthless sun of Henry's wrath. Even Anne's attendants, who had once reverently met her gaze, now lowered their eyes, their speech reduced to quiet whispers. It was as if her presence had become shameful, something to be hidden or denied. The isolation slowly fractured Anne's sense of herself, leading her to wonder if she was truly present or merely a ghost haunting her own memories. Anne, ever perceptive, soon realized the depth of her erasure extended beyond mere symbolism. It was aimed directly at obliterating her truth from history itself. She had become inconvenient to the narrative that Henry VIII wished to weave a narrative in which his reign was unquestioned, his morality flawless, his authority absolute. Her memories, her words, her very existence stood as inconvenient contradictions to the king's carefully curated self-image. Thus, history itself needed to be rewritten. The Queen, who had once reshaped the kingdom, would now be erased from its chronicles, reduced to whispers, distorted tales, and fading memories. Yet within this slow erosion of her identity, Anne fought quietly for remnants of dignity, guarding fiercely the remaining fragments of self that still flickered defiantly. In the privacy of her stark chamber, she wrote letters destined to be destroyed, poured prayers into silence, and paced relentlessly, each step asserting the existence she was denied. Her slender fingers traced imagined letters across the stone walls, inscribing invisible testimonies of her innocence. Her voice, when she spoke, emerged stronger, more resonant, despite the physical frailty that began to overtake her. Anne knew she was losing the fight against oblivion, yet she resisted with the determination of one who understood that memory itself was the final battleground. Outside her walls, courtiers moved quickly to dismantle Anne's historical footprint, burning documents, silencing voices, reshaping stories. She could sense in the unspoken tension that pervaded her cell the speed with which she was being erased, and knew how fragile truth could become when measured against power's ruthless demands. Yet Anne, in quiet rebellion, refused to yield completely to despair. She understood instinctively the paradox at the heart of Henry's campaign of erasure. In seeking to obliterate her memory, the king was inadvertently ensuring that her name would resonate louder in whispers, remembered precisely for the cruelty of its disappearance. As the day of her execution drew closer, Anne's quiet resilience became her final act of defiance. Though history would attempt to erase her, she grasped tightly onto the simple dignity of her humanity, determined to ensure that even as her physical existence faded, echoes of her truth would linger fragile yet hauntingly persistent in the memories of those who had once loved her. Anne's final days within the tower became a slow descent into the profound solitude of her own mind. Behind the iron-bound doors, silence was both companion and tormentor, amplifying the slightest whispers of memory, deepening the echoes of regret. In this solitude, Anne faced not just the looming spectre of death, but the painful vulnerability of introspection, a reckoning that stripped away royal trappings to reveal the fragile core beneath. Confined in those somber chambers, Anne's thoughts turned inward, replaying her life with meticulous intensity. Memories surfaced vividly, some warmly comforting, others sharp as freshly honed steel. She recalled moments of youthful ambition, believing naively that she could master the currents of court intrigue and navigate safely through treacherous royal favour. She remembered Henry's early passion, his once tender words whispered softly beneath tapestried canopies, his promises glittering like distant stars. How quickly those stars had burned out, leaving only darkness in their wake. But now, beneath this shadowed introspection, Anne's resolve flickered. Doubt seeped into the corners of her mind, corrosive and persistent. Could she have foreseen this outcome? Had she been blind to warning signs lost in her ambition? Or perhaps too secure in the power she believed she possessed, regret bitter as vinegar pooled heavily in her heart? She thought often of Elizabeth, her precious daughter, born of love and ambition, yet left vulnerable now, unprotected against a court that had shown Anne no mercy. The thought of Elizabeth's uncertain future twisted painfully inside her, a torment worse than the executioner's blade. Anne found herself haunted too by the faces of those who had suffered in the wake of her ascent. Cardinal Wolsey, fallen from grace, whose agonized eyes once met hers in silent reproach. Catherine of Aragon, dignified even in her humiliating exile, whose quiet dignity now haunted Anne's sleepless nights. Anne recognized in their fates the same pattern that now threatened to engulf her, a cycle driven relentlessly by Henry's volatile desires and the ruthless mechanisms of power. Yet, amid this painful introspection lay moments of unexpected clarity, glimmers of truth that pierced the darkness of her confinement. Anne saw now that power so alluring in its glittering promise was itself a fleeting illusion, ever fragile and easily shattered. The throne she had longed for, fought for, had brought no lasting peace, no genuine security. Instead, it was a gilded cage trapping her within its false promises and inescapable dangers. The very mechanisms of authority that Anne had once mastered now ground inexorably against her, an irony as bitter as it was profound. In the shadowed solitude of her chamber, Anne began to detach slowly from the earthly world that had betrayed her. Her mind, weary yet sharp, sought refuge in faith, recalling the quiet prayers of her childhood, whispered softly with her mother. Her fingers pale and delicate turned prayer beads gently, each bead a whispered plea, each plea a fragile hope. Though she had known wealth, privilege, and power, Anne now craved only a simple mercy, one elusive, intangible, and achingly human. Servants later recounted how Anne in those final days appeared strangely at peace, her eyes luminous, yet resigned, her posture calm, despite the inevitability she faced. Some found comfort in her quiet dignity. Others felt unnerved, sensing something profound, almost sacred, had shifted within her. Anne herself understood deeply that she no longer belonged to the earthly pageantry of court. She was transitioning slowly, but irrevocably, from queen to martyr, from flesh to symbol. A transformation orchestrated not by her captors, but by her own internal reckoning. As dawn broke on her final day, Anne stepped toward the scaffold, prepared not simply to die, but to surrender willingly to history's judgment. She knew the narrative crafted by Henry would attempt to erase her truth, yet something within her, resilient and quietly defiant, understood that even the king's absolute power could not silence the echoes of her humanity. Anne's mind, her final refuge, carried memories and truths that would endure, fragile yet haunting, beyond the blade that awaited her. The morning of Anne's execution arrived cloaked in soft mist, as though nature itself hesitated to witness the spectacle about to unfold. Tower Green, normally an innocuous patch of grass nestled within fortress walls, now transformed into a chilling stage meticulously prepared for a queen's humiliation. Guards stood motionless in precise ranks, their faces expressionless as if sculpted from stone. Around them clustered courtiers in hushed anticipation, their garments richly embroidered, but hearts uneasily silent. The scaffold itself stood stark and unforgiving, a simple wooden platform designed not just to take a life, but to strip it of all dignity. Anne emerged from her prison chambers in a plain gown starkly white, the fabric whispering quietly against stone as she stepped with deliberate grace. Her head was high, her expression composed a delicate porcelain mask hiding turmoil beneath. She moved slowly, purposefully meeting the gaze of spectators with a calm defiance that left some uncomfortably shaken. Yet even as Anne maintained her dignity, the cruelty of spectacle persisted around her. Every detail of the execution was deliberately calculated to amplify fear, to magnify humiliation, and to remind all present of Henry's absolute dominance. Upon reaching the scaffold, Anne paused momentarily, absorbing the stark reality of the final stage of her life. The executioner stood waiting. His blade concealed, yet present, a silent promise of swift death. He had been brought specially from France, an act perversely generous, ensuring that the Queen's death would be both swift and refined. The irony was profound. Anne, who had once been celebrated by the French court, now faced her end, delivered by a French blade. Henry had intended it, so a final humiliation masked as mercy. Anne knelt gently upon the straw-strewn boards, her posture elegant, even in submission, her breathing steady and controlled. Her attendants, though deeply moved, remained stoically silent, fearful of displaying compassion too openly lest it be read as defiance. Anne glanced upward, scanning the crowd for faces she once knew well, searching perhaps for any trace of remorse or humanity among those gathered. Yet eyes met hers briefly and hurriedly looked away, unable or unwilling to confront their complicity in this grim pageantry. Anne understood with heartbreaking clarity that she stood utterly alone, her final moments witnessed by those who had once adored her, yet now viewed her execution merely as an unavoidable act of statecraft. Anne's final speech was brief yet poignant, carefully chosen words spoken with quiet strength. She did not confess guilt, nor did she accuse. Rather, she forgave generously, perhaps defiantly, knowing her forgiveness would linger uneasily in the minds of those who orchestrated her demise. Her voice, clear and resonant, despite the oppressive silence, carried across the courtyard. Her quiet dignity unsettling spectators, undermining the very spectacle they had come to witness. Then Anne lowered her head, neck bared gracefully for the executioner's blade. The crowd grew utterly still, an unbearable tension gripping their collective breath. With a swift, fluid motion, the executioner swung the blade, an elegant cruelty, precise and effective. A gasp rippled softly through the crowd as Anne's severed head fell silently onto the platform, her dark hair spilling softly around a face frozen in quiet dignity, eyes momentarily open and reflective, as if registering one final fleeting thought. Witnesses later spoke in haunted whispers of Anne's final seconds of twitching fingers, involuntary spasms, a ghastly dance of nerves and muscles released from conscious control, yet driven briefly by fading impulses. The spectacle intended to humiliate and terrify succeeded beyond measure, imprinting itself permanently upon the minds of those present. Courtiers and servants alike left Tower Green visibly shaken, forever haunted by images they could never unsee. In this chilling choreography of death, Anne became not merely victim but symbol, a stark reminder of power's terrifying capability to strip away dignity, rewrite truth, and weaponize spectacle itself. Her final moments, carefully designed for maximum cruelty, would resonate quietly and persistently through history, revealing the fragility of humanity beneath the cold weight of absolute authority. In the eerie aftermath of Anne's execution, a profound silence settled over the tower. Blood seeped quietly between the wooden planks of the scaffold, staining the ground beneath an indelible mark hidden hastily by fresh straw, but never fully erased from memory. Courtiers departed swiftly, anxious to distance themselves from the unsettling image of Anne's final moments, yet unable to forget the vivid, chilling details. This spectacle, intended to secure Henry's dominance, instead embedded itself deeply in the collective consciousness and enduring trauma that whispered softly beneath the polished surfaces of courtly manners. Witnesses recounted in hushed voices the unnerving physiological aftermath of Anne's decapitation, fleeting involuntary movements, spasms of muscles no longer governed by conscious thought, a brief flicker in the Queen's eyes, suggesting a lingering awareness. Though science now views such responses as mere biological reflexes, medieval minds found them deeply troubling, interpreting them as silent accusations, echoes of Anne's unjust fate reverberating through her severed body. The line between life and death, between awareness and oblivion, seemed disturbingly porous in these final ghastly moments. Anne's attendants tasked with the solemn duty of preparing her remains, moved with gentle reverence, tinged by horror. Their quiet ministrations washing pale skin, smoothing dark hair, wrapping the slender form carefully in simple linen, were carried out amid oppressive silence, punctuated only by soft sobs quickly stifled. Those who had cared for Anne in life now tended to her body in death, their hearts burdened by memories of her vivacity, her charm, her humanity, reduced cruelly to lifeless flesh. Among the witnesses and servants, emotional scars deepened quietly into psychological wounds that would last lifetimes. Nightmares soon haunted the sleep of guards and courtiers alike, each dream replaying Anne's final moments in relentless detail, the blade's swift arc, the sickening thud, the lifeless gaze staring accusingly upward. Those present became unwilling bearers of Anne's memory, witnesses not just to her death, but to the grotesque spectacle that turned a queen into a cautionary tale. Their minds, like unwilling vessels, carried fragments of Anne's truth, unable to escape the persistent echoes of her tragedy. The impact of Anne's execution rippled outward, subtly reshaping the emotional landscape of Henry's court. Courtiers who had once confidently navigated royal favour now moved more cautiously, understanding vividly how quickly privilege could transform into ruin. Ambition tempered itself with fear. Loyalty grew uncertain, shallow, and wary. Anne's death became a silent warning, a ghostly reminder that no one, not even a queen, was immune to the brutal whims of power. Yet perhaps the deepest wound of all was suffered by Anne's family, especially her young daughter, Elizabeth. Though shielded from witnessing her mother's death, Elizabeth absorbed quietly the trauma inflicted by whispers, half-truths, and careful silences surrounding Anne's demise. The girl, already precocious and perceptive, would carry within herself a shadowy legacy, the image of her mother erased, vilified, and silenced. Elizabeth's mind became a battleground between truth and royal narrative, between memory and calculated oblivion, a struggle she would navigate silently for decades. Anne's execution had sought to extinguish her truth, yet its chilling spectacle inadvertently preserved fragments of it within the collective memory. Instead of fading quietly into oblivion, Anne's life and its violent end resonated, persistently woven quietly into the fabric of history itself. Her death became not merely a cautionary tale, but a haunting reflection of how fragile humanity could become beneath the crushing weight of absolute power. And so, even as Anne's physical remains were discreetly buried beneath the chapel floor, her story lingered, imprinted silently upon the minds and hearts of those who witnessed her final moments. Anne Boleyn's legacy was sealed not in monuments or chronicles, but in the quiet, persistent trauma carried within the souls of generations that followed. The spectacle designed to silence her had instead embedded her memory deeply into history's fabric, fragile, unsettling, yet impossible to fully erase. In the quiet corridors of power, Anne's absence left a silence louder than any cry. Her rooms, emptied of her belongings and scrubbed clean of her presence, became ghostly reminders of the ease with which history could be erased. Yet the memory of her execution, intended to extinguish all traces of her existence, lingered stubbornly, an intangible but unmistakable shadow haunting the hearts and minds of the English court. Her story survived not through official records or portraits, but within whispered conversations and restless dreams preserved quietly by those who had witnessed the cruelty firsthand. Nowhere was Anne's lingering presence felt more profoundly than in the solemn gaze of her young daughter Elizabeth. At only 3 years old, when Anne met her fate, Elizabeth would grow into her legacy, shaped quietly by loss, absence, and ambiguity. She matured under the weight of silenced questions, unspoken truths, and carefully cultivated ignorance. Her father rarely spoke Anne's name, and when he did, it emerged as a harsh accusation, a warning designed to reinforce royal legitimacy and condemn Anne's memory as a dangerous aberration. Elizabeth listened silent and observant, absorbing this conflicted inheritance with an uncanny maturity beyond her years. Yet in Elizabeth's eyes, dark, intelligent, quietly defiant courtiers saw unsettling echoes of Anne. Her gestures mirrored her mother's unconscious grace. Her sharp wit and penetrating gaze recalled vividly the very woman Henry sought so vigorously to erase. Elizabeth carried within her the quiet rebellion of memory, embodying Anne's silenced truth, her erased legacy quietly reasserting itself through subtle yet unmistakable patterns. Even as Elizabeth navigated the dangerous landscape of royal favour, she became unknowingly the silent custodian of Anne's story, a living testament to a truth that refused to be extinguished. Decades later, when Elizabeth herself ascended the throne, her mother's ghost stood quietly behind her, a shadow unseen, yet powerfully felt. Elizabeth's reign would become defined not only by its accomplishments, but also by its quiet reclamation of Anne's memory. Portraits subtly recalled Anne's proud stance and discerning eyes. Court rituals echoed Anne's elegant tastes and refined manners. Without ever explicitly acknowledging it, Elizabeth wove her mother's truth subtly back into the fabric of royal legitimacy, reclaiming quietly what had been stripped away by violence and silence. Yet, despite Elizabeth's quiet defiance, Anne's historical legacy remained fragile, vulnerable to distortion, manipulation, and erasure. Each generation that followed interpreted Anne's life and death according to prevailing biases, anxieties, and values, reshaping her image repeatedly to suit contemporary needs. She became alternately a tragic victim, a seductive temptress, a political martyr, or a cautionary tale, her true self obscured behind layers of shifting interpretation. But beneath these shifting narratives, Anne's essential humanity quietly persisted, a haunting reminder of history's tenuous grasp on truth. Her life, her death, her erasure, and her quiet reclamation by Elizabeth illuminated powerfully how authority can attempt to rewrite reality itself, yet ultimately fail to silence entirely the echoes of a life unjustly taken. Anne Boleyn, in her quiet dignity, resilience, and final courage, exposed the unsettling fragility of power and memory, demonstrating vividly how truth, though vulnerable, can persist even in silence. In this light, Anne's legacy becomes not simply one of tragedy, but of quiet resilience. Her voice persisting subtly through history, challenging silently the narratives imposed upon her. In Elizabeth's reign and beyond, Anne's memory persisted stubbornly, quietly, yet undeniably, a reminder of power's limitations, of memory's endurance, and of humanity's fragile yet unyielding persistence. And perhaps most hauntingly of all, Anne's story reveals the lingering question at the heart of power itself. Can truth ever be fully silenced? As generations pass, her memory remains suspended between history and myth, between truth and erasure, embodying quietly the unsettling fragility of human legacy. In the end, Anne's final legacy resides not in written words or grand monuments, but in the quiet persistence of memory itself, enduring silently within the echoes of history, fragile, uncertain, yet impossible to entirely erase. Anne Boleyn remains quietly defiant, her legacy resonating softly through centuries, a shadowy reflection that power, despite its attempts, cannot fully extinguish.